My dad attacked my brother, and when I stepped in, he turned his wrath on me. Instead, I never expected that trying to defend my brother would lead to me becoming the target of my father's rage. What started as a simple attempt to stop the shouting quickly spiraled into something far worse. I never realized how exhausting being the middle ground in my family could be until that night. My name is Emily, and I'm 16 years old. Life at home had always been a bit chaotic, but that particular evening, it felt like everything was about to unravel. It wasn't just the typical chaos you expect from a family with an older sibling still living at home and parents juggling their expectations. It was something deeper, more suffocating. I've always been close with my brother Jake. He's 20 now, a college student, but unlike the stereotypical college students you hear about, he wasn't the one running around with a full schedule or making plans for his future. He was still living with our parents, trying to figure out what he wanted to do. The truth is, he wasn't really doing much of anything. Jake didn't have a job, and honestly, I wasn't sure what his plans were after college. He was living under the same roof as our parents, but there was this constant unspoken tension in the air whenever we sat down for dinner, or when mom and dad would have their conversations in the other room. It was always about Jake getting a job, Jake doing something with his life, Jake taking responsibility. I didn't understand the pressure he was under, but I could feel it almost like it was something contagious. The arguments were frequent and they were getting louder. Dad had always been a bit intense when it came to responsibilities, and his patience was thin. He wasn't just the provider of our household. He was also the one who expected everyone else to live up to his high standards. I always admired his drive, his ambition, and his ability to keep everything organized. But lately it seemed like that same ambition was turning into frustration, and unfortunately, Jake was the one bearing the brunt of it. That night, as I was sitting in the living room, I heard it again. The raised voices. My brother Jake and Dad in yet another heated discussion about Jake's future. It was around 11 p.m. It was supposed to be a quiet night one where I could retreat to my room and unwind. But instead I found myself on edge, caught in the middle of their argument. I knew it was about to escalate, but I didn't expect what came next. Jake, if I die tomorrow, how are you going to manage the bills? Huh, you think you're ready for this life? You wouldn't even know how to pay a single one. My father's voice boomed through the house, cutting through the silence of the night. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that, but tonight it felt different. There was something final in his tone, something that made the air feel thicker, heavier. Jake didn't respond right away, but I could see the tension building in him. He had heard this before, and honestly, I could tell he was trying to keep calm, trying not to lose his temper. But Dad didn't let up. The words continued to fly, each one a reminder of how my brother wasn't living up to Dad's expectations. Dad, can you stop talking about death? I'm about to go to sleep, I called out from the living room, my voice breaking through the noise. I didn't know why I said it. Maybe it was because I couldn't bear to hear it anymore. Or maybe it was because I knew deep down that the constant reminders of how we were all falling short were slowly eating away at me. The room went silent for a moment. Then, just as I thought the situation was going to calm down, my father turned on me. Don't interrupt me when I'm speaking. I saw you, and you're not. His words were cut off by the rise in his voice, the anger that seeped into every syllable. He didn't even finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. I had interrupted him, and that was enough to trigger his fury. It wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a battle that I didn't even know I was involved in until I found myself in the middle of it. I walked away feeling the weight of everything pressed down on me. The door to my room felt miles away, and as I walked down the hallway, the tears started to form. They weren't just tears of frustration. They were tears of helplessness. I had never felt so small in my own house. The constant tension, the yelling, the anger, it had all been building up over time, and now it felt like it was finally consuming me. In my room, I collapsed on my bed, the tears flowing freely. My heart ached, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was how things were always going to be. I felt like I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the tension, the anger, and the constant feeling that nothing I did was ever enough. I was just there, a bystander in my own life, unable to break free from the cycle that had been playing out over and over again in our household. I had tried to talk to my brother before, tried to understand what he was going through, but it seemed like there was no way to fix it, no way to make it stop. I was stuck, and as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if my own feelings were valid or if I was just being overly sensitive. I had been on my period for 3 days now, and maybe that was making everything feel even more intense, but it didn't change the fact that I was angry. angrier than I had ever been before. Why was it always Jake who got the brunt of it? Why did I feel so invisible in all of this? Was I just overreacting? Or was it something more? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't keep letting this happen. The next morning, I woke up with the feeling of heaviness still hanging over me. The argument from last night hadn't left my mind. In fact, it only seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. It wasn't just the fight itself that bothered me. It was the way it made me feel. I felt powerless, like I had no voice in my own home. Sure, I was only 16, but that didn't mean I didn't have thoughts or feelings of my own. I hated how my dad's words always cut so deeply. I hated how every time I tried to speak up, I was immediately shut down. I dragged myself out of bed, the emotional exhaustion still weighing me down. As I walked down the stairs, I could hear my parents talking in the kitchen. Their voices were quieter this time, but the tension was still there. I could feel it in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Dad was sitting at the table looking over some papers while Mom was making breakfast. Neither of them said anything to me when I entered the room. It was as if I was invisible. I sat down at the table trying to figure out how to even begin addressing what had happened the night before. Mom noticed me first. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, like she was trying to read me. "You're up early," she said, her voice soft but tinged with an edge of concern. I didn't know how to answer her, so I just nodded. Jake had already left the house by the time I came downstairs. He was in college, so he was always busy, but that didn't stop the guilt from creeping in. I hadn't talked to him much about what happened. We'd never been the closest, but I knew he was hurting too. Dad's constant berating had a way of sinking into your soul, and I wasn't sure how much longer Jake could handle it before he snapped. As I sat there, I started to replay the argument over and over in my mind. Dad had been harsh, but I had done what any older sister would do. I had stood up for Jake. And for what? To be yelled at. To be told. I wasn't allowed to interrupt. My chest tightened as the anger started to bubble up inside me again. I wasn't just mad at Dad anymore. I was mad at the whole situation. I was mad that Jake was stuck in this endless cycle of failure, and I was mad that I felt like I was trapped in the middle of it. But the worst part was that I couldn't fix it. I couldn't change how Dad felt about Jake, or how Jake felt about himself. The truth was, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to make things better. I could barely keep my own emotions in check, let alone help fix the mess that seemed to be my family's dynamic. As the day dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling of frustration. At school, I found it hard to concentrate. The normal teenage worries, the tests, the social pressures, the homework seemed so insignificant compared to what was going on at home. It wasn't like I could tell anyone about what had happened. Who would understand? What would I even say? Hey, my dad yelled at my brother for not getting a job, and then he yelled at me for interrupting him. It felt so trivial, so insignificant compared to other problems people were dealing with. But it wasn't trivial to me. It was my life, and it was crushing me. I knew I needed to talk to someone, but I didn't know who. My friends at school couldn't understand this kind of situation. They'd never been in a house where everything felt so tense all the time, where one wrong word or action could set off an explosion of anger and disappointment. After school, I found myself walking home in a daze, my mind still consumed by the events of the previous night. When I got home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. My parents were in their usual spots. Mom was in the kitchen and Dad was in the living room. The only difference was that Jake wasn't there. He had taken his usual spot on the couch with his headphones on, trying to tune out the world. It was his way of coping, I guess. He didn't have to deal with Dad's expectations if he wasn't around to hear them. I made my way upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed, my mind racing. I hated feeling this way. I hated how every time I tried to stand up for someone else, I got punished for it. It was like no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the chaos of my family. Suddenly, I remembered the way I had felt last night when Dad had yelled at me. That was the moment it hit me, the realization that I had been silenced for far too long. It wasn't just about that particular argument. It was about all the times before that when I had tried to make my voice heard and had been dismissed. It was the feeling of never being good enough, never living up to the expectations that everyone seemed to have for me. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep allowing my emotions to be disregarded or my thoughts to be ignored. Something had to change. But how? How do you change something that's been ingrained in your family for years? I knew I couldn't do it alone. I couldn't fix my family's problems by myself, but I also couldn't stay silent anymore. I had to find a way to make myself heard. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the brink of something big. But what that was, I had no idea. All I knew was that I was done feeling invisible. Done feeling like I didn't matter. It was time to speak up. But speaking up would come with consequences. And I wasn't sure I was ready for them. The days following the argument felt like an endless cycle of tension and silence. My relationship with my dad had always been strained, but this time it felt different. There was something unspoken in the air that made it hard to even look him in the eye. He seemed to be walking on eggshells around me, like he wasn't sure how to approach me after what had happened. It was uncomfortable, and yet I could feel the walls closing in on me, the suffocating silence pressing down on me like a weight. I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't stand being silenced, being ignored, or being treated like my feelings didn't matter. It had been years of watching my dad belittle my brother and watching my mom try to hold everything together without ever acknowledging the damage it was doing to all of us. I couldn't keep quiet any longer, but the idea of confronting my father about everything was terrifying. What if he didn't listen? What if he yelled again? What if he accused me of being overly sensitive like he always did? But I knew that if I didn't say something, nothing would ever change. The anger and frustration had been building up inside me for so long that I felt like I was about to explode. One afternoon after school, I found myself in the kitchen alone with my dad. My mom was out running errands and my brother had gone to hang out with his friends. It was just me and him. My heart raced as I stared at him, unsure of how to begin. Should I even start? Did I have the right to? But the words came out anyway. Dad. I said, my voice shaky but determined we need to talk. He looked up from the stack of papers in front of him, his face unreadable. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the same exhaustion I'd seen in myself. He didn't respond at first, but he didn't dismiss me either. That was something. It was a small opening. I don't like how you yell at me and Jake. I continued, trying to keep my voice steady. It's hurtful, and it makes me feel like I don't matter. You act like we're not good enough, and it feels like we're always disappointing you. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence between us stretched thick and heavy. I could feel the tension in the room, but I couldn't back down. I had to say what I was feeling. You don't get it, do you? I said, my voice growing louder despite myself. Jake is trying, but you don't see it. And I'm trying too, but you never listen. Every time we try to talk, you just shut us down. My dad's eyes flickered with something I couldn't read. I thought for a moment that maybe he was going to yell again, that maybe this would end, just like the other arguments had, loud and explosive. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there staring at me. It was almost like he was processing what I had said, trying to understand it. Finally, he spoke. I don't yell at you to hurt you, he said quietly. I do it because I want the best for you. I want you to be strong, to be independent. You can't afford to be soft in this world. And Jake, he needs to learn responsibility. He needs to understand that life doesn't wait for you to catch up. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't about being strong or independent, it was about respect. It was about feeling seen and heard. But instead, I stayed quiet. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us saying anything. I realized then that this was the problem. He didn't understand me. He didn't understand what it was like to feel invisible in your own home, to feel like you were constantly being judged and never good enough. I get that you want the best for us, I said, my voice softer now. But there has to be a better way. Yelling at us isn't helping. It just makes things worse. For a second, I thought he was going to argue. But instead, he sighed, rubbing his face with his hand. I don't know how to do it differently. I've always done it this way. It's how I was raised. I don't know any other way. It was a breakthrough. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall. He admitted that he didn't know how to change. And that was something. That was more than I had ever expected. Maybe it's time to figure out a new way, I said quietly, because I can't keep living like this. The conversation ended there. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation I had imagined, but it was a start. A small one, but still a start. I wasn't sure if things would change right away or if they would change at all. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had been heard. I had said my piece and my dad had listened. Maybe it wasn't the solution, but it was a step in the right direction. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a little lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally spoken my truth. I had taken control of my voice. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had some power over my own life. But the road ahead was still uncertain. I didn't know what would happen with Jake or how my dad would change. I didn't know if anything would truly improve. But I knew that I couldn't go back to being the silent, invisible girl I had been. I had to keep pushing forward, even if it was just one small step at a time. Days turned into weeks, and I started to notice small shifts in the dynamics at home. It wasn't immediate. Nothing is ever as instant as we wish it would be, but I could see that my dad was trying. Maybe it wasn't the grand, sweeping change I had hoped for, but it was enough to make me feel like my words hadn't been completely lost. The yelling didn't happen as much. When it did, it wasn't the same, and I didn't feel as small when it did. But Jake was still Jake, and he hadn't changed much. He was still the same 20-year-old college student who lived at home and barely lifted a finger to help out. Despite all of Dad's rants about responsibility, he didn't seem to be taking them seriously. He'd still come home from classes, toss his backpack on the couch, and retreat to his room for hours on end. Every so often, I'd overhear Dad's voice rise, his frustration bubbling over again as he tried to get Jake to look for a job. But Jake's response was always the same. He'd either ignore it or give some vague excuse about how he didn't have time with his studies. At first, I tried to stay out of it. I didn't want to get caught up in their arguments again. I had my own battles to fight. But slowly, I found myself slipping back into the role of mediator. The one who tried to smooth things over, who tried to make sense of things that made no sense at all. One afternoon, after another long day at school, I came home to hear raised voices from the living room. I knew instantly it was Jake and Dad again. They were going at it just like before. My heart sank as I sat down on the stairs listening to the exchange. It was like déjà vu, the same cycle of frustration, anger, and unresolved tension, and it was wearing me down again. "I don't care if you're busy," Dad's voice thundered. "You can't sit around here doing nothing. You're 20 years old. You need to start acting like an adult." Jake, as usual, was defensive. "I have my own life, Dad. I'm trying to get through college. I don't have time to deal with your nonsense right now." I could feel the frustration building up inside me as I sat there hidden behind the wall, unable to do anything but listen. It was exhausting. It was maddening. And most of all, it was heartbreaking. My brother was stuck, and so was my dad. Neither of them could see how deep the rift between them had grown. And then there was me, caught between them, wanting to scream at both of them for being so stubborn, for not seeing how they were destroying the family, how they were destroying each other. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't know if I was being too sensitive, but I had to intervene. I had to say something. If I didn't, I'd drown in the same toxic cycle that had trapped my dad and brother. I walked into the living room, cutting their conversation short. Both of them looked at me startled, like I was interrupting something important. But I didn't care. I was done standing on the sidelines. "Dad, Jake." "This isn't working," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and frustration. "This isn't helping either of you. Dad yelling at Jake isn't going to get him to change. And Jake hiding from the reality of life won't make your problems disappear. You're both making it worse." My dad's face hardened at my interruption, but I didn't back down. I couldn't. I had to speak up, even if it meant facing his wrath. "This needs to stop." I continued, my heart pounding in my chest. "We're family. We need to figure this out together, but not by yelling at each other and shutting each other down." For a moment, no one spoke. The room was heavy with tension, as if everyone was waiting for the other to speak first. But when Jake finally spoke, it wasn't with the same anger he usually had. It wasn't with the same defensiveness. It was quieter, more resigned. "You're right," he said, barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm doing. I just feel stuck. I don't know how to fix things." It wasn't much, but it was something. It was the first time I'd ever heard Jake admit that he didn't have all the answers. It was a crack in his armor, and it gave me a glimmer of hope. Dad, on the other hand, just stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. I couldn't tell if he was surprised by Jake's words or if he just didn't know how to respond. But for the first time, he didn't yell. He didn't get angry. Instead, he exhaled slowly and looked down at his hands. "I don't know how to fix things either," Dad admitted, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "But we can try. I don't want to keep fighting. I'm just trying to make sure you two don't end up like me." There it was. The vulnerability that I had never seen before. My dad had always been the strong one, the one who had the answers, the one who was supposed to fix everything. But in that moment, he was just as lost as the rest of us. And that in some strange way was a relief. It didn't solve anything, but it made me realize that we were all just trying to figure things out. We were all human. And for once it felt like we were finally on the same page. The conversation didn't magically resolve everything, and I knew it would take time. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like there was hope. There was a chance for us to change, for us to rebuild. And that small glimmer of hope was enough to keep me going. The weeks that followed were filled with a mixture of progress and setbacks. While things weren't perfect, nothing ever is. I could feel the small, steady changes in our household. My dad was less quick to anger, though his patience was still a work in progress. He started listening more than he used to, and though it wasn't always easy for him, there were moments when I could see him genuinely trying to connect with Jake, even if they didn't always know how to speak the same language. As for Jake, the biggest change was that he started talking. Talking about his struggles, his fears, and his sense of inadequacy. It wasn't that he suddenly became a perfect son, or that he found a job overnight. No, those things took time, but he started opening up. He started acknowledging the weight of his own choices, the mistakes he had made, and the pressure he had felt to live up to everyone's expectations. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the tension would flare up again, but there was this new understanding between us, an understanding that we were all trying to heal, trying to figure out how to exist in this strange space together where nothing was certain and everything was in flux. But despite the breakthroughs, something inside me was still unsettled. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was carrying a weight of my own. It was like I had been holding my breath for so long that I didn't know how to let it out. It was one late evening when everyone had gone to bed that I found myself sitting at the kitchen table staring at the empty space in front of me. The house was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was trapped in a storm. But there was still something gnawing at me, a quiet ache that had been lingering ever since that night when everything erupted. It wasn't just the yelling that had affected me, it was the helplessness. The feeling of being caught in the middle, the feeling that no one was seeing me. I had spent so much of my life trying to keep the peace, trying to be the one who stepped in when things got out of hand, that I had forgotten what it felt like to take care of myself, to stand up for myself. I thought about that night when I had stood up to my dad. I had been scared, unsure of how it would go, but I had done it, and I had felt empowered in that moment. But since then, I had noticed that I had been slipping back into old patterns. I had been trying too hard to fix everything for everyone else without considering what I needed, without considering how I was feeling. I realized then that I needed to start doing better for myself. I couldn't keep being the peacemaker if I was losing myself in the process. I had to take the same courage I had found that night with my dad and apply it to my own life. I needed to speak up for myself, not just for others. I needed to stand firm, not just for my family, but for me. The next day I sat down with my parents, both of them, and I said something I had never said before. I need you both to understand that I'm not okay either. I've been trying to hold everything together, but I can't do it on my own. I need support too. I can't keep being the one who holds everything up. I need to be allowed to feel things, and I need space to heal just like you both do. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to say. But it was also the most freeing. I could feel the tension inside me begin to ease just a little as I said those words. My parents listened, really listened, and there was no defensiveness in their responses. They didn't try to fix it. They didn't try to downplay it. They just heard me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't invisible. I felt seen. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't a magic fix for all of our problems. But in that moment, I realized that healing doesn't happen all at once. It's not about having everything figured out in an instant. It's about taking the small, steady steps. It's about knowing that we are all struggling in our own ways, but we are still family. And sometimes that's enough to get through. We still had our ups and downs, of course. Jake still hadn't found a job, and Dad still had his moments of frustration. But there was something different now. We were no longer just walking around in circles, stuck in old patterns. We were moving forward even if it was slow. We were learning bit by bit how to communicate with each other, how to listen, how to understand. I knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with more challenges, but I also knew that we had come a long way. And for the first time in a while, that was enough for me. As I sat there looking out the window at the night sky, I let out the breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. Things weren't perfect, but they were real. And for now, that was more than enough. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the weight of being misunderstood or alone, I urge you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means more than you know and helps us share more powerful stories that touch the heart. Let's grow together and create a space where we can heal, reflect, and learn. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that might speak to your soul. Thank you for listening, and remember, you're never truly alone.